The sound of a steel door hitting a frame isn't just noise in a place like Blackwood. It's a period at the end of a sentence you didn't want to read. I was standing in Block C, the kind of airless, windowless gut of a building where the oxygen feels like it's been breathed by 1,000 desperate men before it ever hits your lungs. I had my mag light out, the beam cutting through a haze of industrial floor stripper and floor wax dust, and I was staring at cell 412. According to the digital manifest on my hip, 412 had been vacant for 3 weeks following the suicide of a low-level car thief from Queens. But as I stood there, the hair on the back of my neck stood up because someone inside was humming. It wasn't a tune. It was a low, rhythmic vibration that matched the exact frequency of the cooling fans in the ceiling, a sound designed to be invisible. I pressed my face to the reinforced plexiglass, expecting to see a squatter or a ghost, but the cell was empty. No mattress, no personal effects, just the concrete slab. Yet the humming didn't stop. It got louder, vibrating against the glass right next to my ear, and for a split second, the shadow of my own head in the beam of the flashlight seemed to turn its neck to look at me before I did. I didn't run. You don't run in a maximum security facility in upstate New York unless you want every sensor in the building to trigger a Tier 1 lockdown. I just backed away, the heavy jingle of the keys on my belt sounding like a mocking laugh in the corridor. I had 3 hours left on a double shift, and the overtime was the only reason my daughter's physical therapy bills were getting paid this month. I needed this job, and the job knew it. That's the thing about Blackwood Correctional. It doesn't just hold inmates. It holds the people who work there too. It finds the structural weakness in your life, the debt, the grief, the fear, and it uses that as the anchor to keep you coming back to a place that shouldn't exist on a map. My name is Elias Thorne. 6 months ago, I was a state trooper with a clean record and a house in the Hudson Valley. Now, I'm a correction officer at a facility that isn't listed in any state budget, wearing a uniform that feels like it's made of lead. I took the transfer because the pay was triple the state average, and they didn't ask questions about the disciplinary hearing that ended my career on the road. They just wanted men who could keep their mouths shut and follow the rhythm of the house. But the rhythm was changing. Tonight, the air smelled like old copper and ozone, and the fluorescent lights weren't just flickering. They were pulsing in time with that hum I'd heard in 412. I made it back to the bubble, the reinforced glass control station that sits at the center of the block. My partner for the night, a 20-year veteran named Miller, was sitting there with his boots up on the console. Miller was the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of salt. Everything about him was white, crystalline, and hard. He didn't look up from his clipboard when I slumped into the chair beside him. He just tapped a pen against the logbook, a steady, irritating tink-tink-tink. "Check 412?" he asked, his voice sounding like gravel being turned in a bucket. "It's empty," I said, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "But the acoustics are off. There's a vibration in the ventilation. Sounds like someone's in there." Miller stopped tapping the pen. He turned his head slowly, his eyes flat and unresponsive, like 2 pieces of unpolished flint. "There's no ventilation in 412, Thorne. We capped that line 2 years ago after the mold outbreak. Whatever you heard, it wasn't the air." He didn't offer an alternative. He didn't even seem surprised. He just went back to his clipboard, but I noticed his hand was shaking just enough to make the pen marks jagged, like a heart monitor readout during a panic attack. I looked at the monitors. 16 screens, 16 angles of grey concrete and steel. On camera 4, which covered the north laundry, I saw a figure move. It was a quick, fluid motion, a blur of orange denim. I leaned in, adjusting the contrast. The laundry was supposed to be dead-bolted at 2200 hours. "Someone's in the laundry," I said, reaching for the radio. Miller's hand shot out, pinning my wrist to the desk with surprising strength. His skin was cold, unnervingly so, like he'd been standing in a freezer. "Don't touch that radio," he whispered, Look again. Look at the shadows, not the light. I looked. The laundry room was empty of people. The machines sat like tombstones in the dim emergency lighting. There was no movement, no orange denim. But then I saw the floor. A trail of wet footprints was appearing on the concrete, one after another, leading from the center of the room toward the heavy industrial dryers. There was no one making them. The water just manifested in the shape of a boot sole, stayed for a second, and then evaporated into the grey. It was a rhythmic march, perfectly timed with the tink-tink-tink of Miller's pen. "The count is 74, Thorne," Miller said, his voice dropping to a low melodic tone I'd never heard from him. "As long as the count is 74, we don't open our mouths. We don't report the laundry. We don't report the humming. We just make the numbers match." "But the manifest says 72, I countered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "We had 2 transfers out this morning, one to Sing Sing, one to the infirmary at Clinton. It's 72. If we log 74, we're asking for an audit." Miller finally looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the sheer, unadulterated terror behind his salt-hardened mask. His eyes were watering, though his face remained still. "It was 72 when you walked in. The building decided it wanted 2 more. It happens on the solstice, and it happens when the humidity drops below 20%. Now, the count is 74. If you want to go home to that little girl of yours, you'll find 2 names in the archive, and you'll write them into the active log. Do it now, before the sensors recalibrate." I stared at him, my brain trying to find a logical exit ramp. Maybe it was a hazing ritual. Maybe Miller was having a psychotic break brought on by too many double shifts in this windowless hell. But the wet footprints on the monitor had reached the dryer, and now the heavy steel door of the machine was slowly, agonizingly swinging open. Something was climbing inside. The machine didn't tilt, but the floor around it sagged as if taking on hundreds of pounds of weight. I didn't argue. Desperation is a powerful silencer. I went to the back of the bubble where the old paper archives were kept. Thousands of files on men who had passed through these walls since the 1970s. These weren't digital. They were heavy, yellowed folders that smelled like vinegar and decay. My hands were fumbling as I pulled a drawer. My mind was racing back to the farm, to the looming foreclosure, to the way my daughter Sarah looked at me when I told her Daddy had found a way to pay for the new prosthetic. I couldn't lose this job. I couldn't be the one who broke the count. I pulled 2 files at random. The first was a man named Arthur Vance, deceased 1988. The second was Thomas Cale, released 1994. I brought them back to the desk. Miller watched me with an intensity that felt like a physical weight, his eyes tracking every movement of my fingers. I opened the active shift log, and with a hand that felt like it belonged to a stranger, I wrote their names into the empty slots for Block C. The moment the ink dried on the page, the humming in the walls stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a thick, pressurized silence that made my ears pop, like being at the bottom of a deep pool. On the monitor, the dryer door in the laundry room slammed shut with a force that should have shattered the glass. The in-use light flickered on, glowing a dull, angry red that seemed to bleed out into the surrounding pixels. "Good boy," Miller said, though there was no praise in his voice. He stood up, grabbing his jacket. "I'm taking my break. 45 minutes. Stay in the bubble. Don't look at the monitors for more than 10 seconds at a time. It's a trick of the refresh rate. Your brain tries to fill in the gaps if you stare too long. If the count changes again, don't wait for me. Just feed it." He walked out of the control station, the magnetic lock hissing as it engaged. I watched him go, feeling a profound sense of isolation. I was alone in the nerve center of a fortress that was seemingly breathing. I checked the time. 1:15. The shift was supposed to end at 600. I leaned back, trying to breathe, trying to convince myself that I was just tired, that the building wanting more was just Miller's colorful way of describing systemic errors in an old facility built on unstable ground. But then, a notification popped up on the primary terminal. It wasn't a standard alert. The text was rendered in an old-style font, flickering in and out of existence. Intake alert, unscheduled transport arrival. Gate 4. We weren't expecting any transports. Not at 1 in the morning in the middle of a New York blizzard. I tapped the camera for Gate 4, the external sally port. The snow was a white curtain, a chaotic swirl of ice, but through the chaos I could see the silhouette of a black transport bus. It didn't have the Department of Corrections markings. It was just matte black, its headlights cut, idling in the cold like a predator waiting in the tall grass. The gate guard, a kid named Holloway who was barely 21 and still had his academy shine, stepped out of the shack to approach the driver's side. I watched him on the screen, his breath blooming in white clouds that were whipped away by the wind. He reached the window, spoke for a moment, and then stopped. He stood perfectly still for nearly 30 seconds, his posture slumping as if his bones had turned to lead. Then, slowly, he took off his cap. He dropped it in the snow, turned around, and walked toward the gate controls with a stiff, mechanical gait. "Holloway status," I said into the intercom, my voice cracking. "We have no scheduled intake. Confirm ID of the transport." No response. Holloway punched the code to open the inner gate. The bus began to roll forward, a slow predatory creep that made no sound on the audio feed. "Holloway, report! Close that gate!" I yelled, my hand hovering over the alarm toggle. He turned toward the camera then. His face was a mask of blankness, but his eyes were wide, and he was pointing at his own throat. He wasn't speaking because he couldn't. Even through the grainy, low-light footage, I could see the horror. His mouth was sealed shut, not with tape or stitches, but with skin. A smooth, seamless graft of flesh had grown over his lips, leaving him a silent, terrified sentry. The bus entered the inner courtyard and stopped. The doors hissed open with a sound like a dying breath. I held my breath, my finger trembling on the alarm, but Miller's voice echoed in my head. "Don't break the count. If I triggered a lockdown now, supervisors would swarm the block. They'd see the logbook. They'd see Vance and Cale." A single figure stepped off the bus. He was wearing an orange inmate jumpsuit, but it was pristine, as if it had just been pressed. He carried no bag, no shackles. He just stood in the snow, looking up at the control bubble. Even through the grainy footage, I recognized the face. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. It was the man from the file I'd just pulled. Thomas Cale, the man who had been released in 1994. He looked exactly the same as he did in his 30-year-old mugshot. He didn't look a day over 25. He didn't have a coat, but he wasn't shivering. He raised a hand and waved directly at the camera, a slow, deliberate motion that felt like a taunt. Then he pointed to his wrist, as if checking a watch he wasn't wearing, and pointed toward Block C. The bus doors closed, and the vehicle immediately began to reverse out of the gate. Holloway stood there, capless in the snow, watching it go. He didn't move to close the gate. He just stood there as the blizzard began to bury him, his skin-sealed mouth a silent testament to the arrival. I sat in the bubble, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off my glasses, and I realized that the names I'd written in the book weren't just placeholders. They weren't just Miller's superstition. They were invitations. I had just authorized the arrival of something that had been waiting 30 years to get back inside, and I'd done it for a pension and a paycheck. My fingers felt cold where the paper had touched them. The intercom on the desk buzzed. It wasn't the gate or the infirmary. It was the internal line from the laundry room. I hesitated, my hand shaking so hard I had to use my other hand to steady it. Then I pressed the button. "Control," I said, my voice barely a whisper, a thin thread of sound in the oppressive silence. For a long time, there was only the sound of a heavy machine tumbling, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a dryer with something heavy inside. Then, a voice came through, wet and muffled, as if the speaker was talking through a mouthful of silt. "Elias," the voice said. It wasn't Miller. It wasn't Holloway. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 5 years, a voice that had been buried under 6 feet of Hudson Valley soil. It was my brother, who had died in a car accident 3 counties away while I was on duty. "Elias, it's cold in here. Why did you put me in the dryer? It's so hot and then it's so cold." I slammed my hand down on the disconnect, my heart jackhammering against my ribs so hard it was painful. My breathing came in ragged, shallow gulps. "It's not real," I told myself over and over like a mantra. "It's the sleep deprivation. It's the carbon monoxide. The building is old. The air is bad. Miller is playing a prank." But the in-use light for the laundry was still red on my monitor, and Thomas Cale was no longer in the courtyard. He was inside the building. I could hear the magnetic locks clicking open in sequence, a path being cleared from the courtyard to Block C. The system was doing it on its own. I looked at the logbook again. I had to fix this. I reached for the whiteout, but as I touched the page, the paper felt warm. Not just warm, it felt alive. The ink of Thomas Cale's name began to pulse, a slow, dark throb that matched the rhythm of my own frantic heartbeat. I tried to pull my hand away, but my fingertips were stuck to the page. It felt like the paper was drinking from me, a sharp, stinging pull at the capillaries of my skin. I yanked my hand back with a grunt of pain, tearing a small layer of skin from my tips. There were 4 tiny, needle-like punctures on my fingertips. Blood, dark and rich, began to well up. A drop fell onto the page, landing right on the 74 Miller had insisted on. The number didn't smear. It absorbed the blood and changed. The ink swirled and rearranged itself, the 4 lengthening and curving until it became a 5. 75. The building didn't want 2 more. It wanted 3. I looked at the courtyard monitor. Cale was gone. In his place, there were 2 figures now. Well, 1 figure and a shadow that didn't match the light. The shadow was taller, broader. I adjusted the zoom, my stomach dropping into a cold, bottomless abyss. The second figure was wearing a state trooper's uniform. It was torn, stained with old oil and dried black blood. He looked up, and I saw my own face. Not a twin, not a double. It was me, exactly as I had looked the night of the accident that ended my career. The night I'd walked away from a wrecked cruiser while my partner stayed trapped inside. The night I'd chosen my own life over the oath I'd sworn. The version of me in the snow didn't wave. He just stood there, staring with an expression of hollow, righteous fury. He pointed at the logbook on the desk, then at his own chest, and finally at the bubble where I sat. The phone in the bubble rang. It was the outside line. The caller ID showed my home number, the farmhouse where Sarah was sleeping. I picked it up, my hand shaking so hard I almost dropped the receiver. "Hello? Daddy?" Sarah's voice was small, distant, as if she were calling from the bottom of a very deep well. There was a static hiss in the background, like the sound of falling snow. "Daddy, there's a man at the window. He says he's here to take me to the farm. But we're already at the farm, Daddy. He has your face, but his eyes are like yours when you're sad. He's crying, Daddy. Why is he crying?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat felt like it had been filled with concrete. I looked at the monitor, and the version of me in the courtyard was gone. There was only Cale, and he was now standing at the heavy steel door of the bubble, his face pressed against the glass. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the logbook. Miller came back into the bubble then. He smelled like tobacco and something metallic, like copper or fresh blood. He looked at the monitor, then at the logbook, then at my bleeding hand. He didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. "You fed it your own blood, Thorne," he said, and for the first time he sounded almost pitying. "That's a rookie mistake. You don't give this place a piece of yourself. Once it has the taste, it won't stop until it's finished the meal. You don't negotiate with the count. You just satisfy it. My daughter, I gasped, grabbing Miller by the collar. He didn't resist. He felt as solid as a stone pillar. She's on the phone. There's something at my house. Miller, what is this place? Where are we? Miller didn't struggle. He just leaned in, his breath cold against my ear, smelling of winter. The house is gone, Elias. It's been gone since you signed the contract. This is the only place that's real now. The Hudson Valley, the trooper life, the girl. It's all just the bait the facility used to get you into the chair. Look at the gate. I looked. Gate 4 was gone. Not just open. Gone. Where the sally port and the blizzard had been, there was now only an endless, yawning expanse of grey limestone and black, stagnant water. The prison wasn't in New York anymore. It wasn't anywhere I recognized. We were floating in a void of industrial decay. Welcome to the permanent shift, Miller whispered, his voice cracking like ice. Let's get to work. The count is 75, and we're still missing one. The building is hungry, Elias, and it knows your name. I looked at the logbook one last time. Beneath the names of Vance and Cale, a third name was appearing in my own handwriting, even though I wasn't holding a pen. The ink was wet, glistening like fresh blood. Sarah Thorne. I didn't scream. I didn't have the breath for it. I just looked at Miller, and he handed me a set of keys that felt like they were made of polished bone. She's in 412, he said, and for a second, I thought I saw a tear trail through the salt of his cheek. Better get down there. You don't want the building to have to remind you twice. It doesn't like to wait for its guests. I took the keys. They were warm, vibrating with that same low hum I'd heard in the cell. I stepped out of the bubble, the heavy door hissing shut behind me, and as the magnetic lock engaged, I realized that the humming wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from inside my own chest, a rhythmic, mechanical pulse that told me I was no longer an observer. I was part of the count. The walk down the corridor to Block C felt like it took hours. The lights didn't just flicker, they pulsed, the intervals between the light getting longer and longer. In the darkness, I could hear things moving in the empty cells, not people, but the sound of heavy furniture being dragged across concrete, the sound of water dripping in a place that should have been dry. I kept my maglite pointed straight ahead, but the beam seemed to be getting shorter, the darkness eating the light. I reached the corner that led to the 400 tier. The air here was colder, the walls covered in a fine layer of white frost that looked like salt. I could hear Sarah's voice again, but it wasn't coming from a phone. It was echoing through the vents, a soft, rhythmic chanting of my name. Elias, Elias, Elias. I stopped. I didn't want to go around that corner. I knew what was waiting in 412, but as I stood there, the floor behind me began to dissolve. The concrete just flaked away into that grey void, stone by stone, moving toward my heels. The building was forcing me forward, pruning the reality behind me so that there was only one direction left to go. I turned the corner. Cell 412 was glowing, not with a light but with a kind of anti-shadow that made the air around it look thin. The door was slightly ajar. I reached out with the bone keys, my hand trembling so much I almost dropped them. The lock didn't need a key. It opened as I approached, the steel moving as if it were made of liquid. I pushed the door open. The cell wasn't empty anymore. It was a perfect recreation of Sarah's bedroom. The pink wallpaper, the stuffed animals, the smell of lavender laundry detergent. It was all there, vivid and impossible in the heart of a concrete fortress. And Sarah was there, sitting on her bed, her back to me. She was brushing her hair, the rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch of the brush matching the tink, tink, tink of Miller's pen. "Sarah," I whispered, stepping into the room. The concrete floor felt like carpet under my boots. She stopped brushing. She didn't turn around. "You're late, Daddy," she said, her voice sounding perfectly normal, perfectly healthy. The man with your face said you were busy with the numbers. He said you had to make sure everyone was counted. Sarah, we have to go. This isn't real. We have to get out of here, I said, reaching for her shoulder. She turned then, and my heart stopped. It was Sarah, but her eyes were gone. In their place were two small, glowing monitors showing the same 16 camera angles from the bubble. Her skin was the color of grey limestone, and when she opened her mouth to speak, I didn't hear a voice. I heard the collective humming of 74 men, a discordant, vibrating roar that shook the very foundations of the room. "But Daddy," she said, the monitors in her eyes flickering to camera 4, showing the laundry room. "The count is 75, and you haven't signed in yet." She held out her hand. In her palm was a small, sharp piece of bone shaped like a pen. "Sign the book, Elias," she said, and her voice was now Miller's, then my dead brother's, then my own. "Sign the book, and the humming will stop. Sign the book, and we can go to the farm." I looked at the bone pen, then at the girl who was no longer my daughter, then at the grey void encroaching on the doorway behind me. I realized then that Blackwood wasn't a prison. It was a digestive system, and I was the last morsel. I took the pen. The moment my fingers closed around the bone, the bedroom vanished. I was standing in the empty cell again, the cold concrete biting through my boots. But I wasn't alone. Miller was there, standing in the corner, his form flickering like a bad television signal. And Thomas Cale was there, leaning against the wall, a cruel smile on his face. "Don't worry, Thorne," Cale said, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "The first 100 years are the hardest. After that, you stop missing the sun." I looked down at the floor. A new logbook was lying there, its pages made of something that looked like dried skin. I knelt down, the bone pen poised over the first line. My hand was no longer shaking. It was as steady as stone. I wrote my name. The hum in my chest intensified, a triumphant roar that drowned out my thoughts. I felt my skin begin to harden, the color fading to gray. I felt the memories of the farm, of the trooper life, of Sarah's laugh, all being pulled out of me, sucked into the paper of the logbook. I looked at Miller. He was fading, his salt-hardened form dissolving into white dust. "Thank you," he whispered, and then he was gone. I stood up. I wasn't Elias Thorne anymore. I was Correction Officer 75. I walked out of the cell and headed back to the bubble. The hallway was no longer dark. It was bathed in the harsh, artificial glow of the monitors. I sat in the chair, put my boots up on the console, and picked up a pen. Tink, tink, tink. I looked at camera 4. The laundry room was empty. But then I saw a trail of wet footprints appearing on the floor, leading toward the dryers. I smiled. The count was 75, and as long as the count was 75, the building was happy. But then a notification popped up on the terminal. "Intake alert. Unscheduled transport arrival. Gate 4. I tapped the camera. Through the snow, I saw a black bus, and stepping off the bus was a man I recognized, a man with a clean record and a daughter who needed help. I leaned into the intercom, my voice sounding like gravel being turned in a bucket. "Welcome to Blackwood, officer," I said. "Check 412. I think I heard something humming." I picked up the clipboard and waited for him to arrive. The shift was just beginning, and in this place the sun never rises. The new officer. I could feel his name now. It was Miller. It had always been Miller. Began to write in the logbook. I felt the ink, my blood being drawn out of the stone and onto the page. He was staring at the monitors, his face pale and sweat-streaked. But he was already moving with that stiff, procedural grace the house demands. He checked the laundry room, his hand trembling on the joystick. He saw the footprints. He heard the humming. And most importantly, he found the archives. He pulled a file. Arthur Vance. Deceased 1988. He wrote it down.
I leaned back in the chair, listening to the facility. It wasn't just humming anymore. It was singing. A low subterranean choir of 75 souls, all perfectly synchronized, all maintaining the delicate balance of the count. I could feel the limestone field outside, the black water of the void, the thousands of other prisons floating in the dark. We were part of a larger network, a cosmic architecture of containment and debt, and in the center of it all was Sarah. I couldn't see her anymore with my eyes, but I could feel her. She was walking through a field of tall grass in the Hudson Valley. She was laughing. She was whole. Every step she took was supported by the weight of my stone heart. Every breath she drew was filtered through the oxygen I no longer needed. It was a fair trade. But the shift goes on. The new miller finished the count. He sat in the bubble, staring at the monitors, waiting for the refresh rate to play tricks on his brain. He didn't know yet that the trick wasn't the refresh rate. It was the reality itself. He didn't know that the phone would ring soon, and it would be his own voice on the other end, crying for help. I stood up from the console, my form finally becoming completely translucent. My time as the primary observer was coming to an end. I was moving deeper into the foundation, becoming the static between the screens, the chill in the air, the sound of the steel door hitting the frame. "Remember," I whispered into his ear, though he only heard it as a distant draft. "Don't break the count, and never ever look at the shadows for more than 10 seconds. I drifted toward the floor, dissolving into the concrete. As I sank into the limestone, I saw the next transport bus approaching the gate. I saw the next man stepping off, his eyes full of desperate hope. I waited for him. I had plenty of room in the foundation. The facility groaned, a deep, satisfied sound that echoed through the void. The count was 75, the shift was eternal, and the humming was the only truth left. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 5 years I didn't feel the cold. I felt the sun on Sarah's face, and that was enough to hold up the world. "Next," the facility whispered through 1,000 vents, and the silence was the only thing that was real. As the new man entered the block, his footsteps echoed with a hollow metallic ring that vibrated through my very essence. I could feel his heartbeat, fast, irregular, fueled by adrenaline and a deep-seated panic. He stopped at the control bubble, his hand hovering over the magnetic lock. I watched him from the shadows, from the very pores of the concrete. He looked at the chair where I had sat, where Miller had sat before me. He saw the logbook, the bone pen, the 16 flickering monitors. He took a deep breath, the air whistling in his lungs. He was trying to be brave. He was trying to convince himself that this was just a job, just a paycheck. He didn't know that he had already been indexed. He sat down. The chair groaned under his weight, a sound that rippled through the limestone foundation. He picked up the pen. Tink, tink, tink. The rhythm began again. The facility exhaled a long, cold breath of ozone and floor wax. The count was 75, and the shift was beginning. I settled into the deep, dark spaces of the foundation, feeling the weight of the souls above me. It was a comfortable weight now, a familiar pressure that defined my existence. I wasn't Elias Thorne anymore. I wasn't Officer 75. I was the house. And the house is always hungry. I felt the new Miller check the laundry monitor. I felt his heart skip a beat as he saw the wet footprints. I felt his hand shake as he opened the archive drawer. He was doing well. He was following the rhythm. He was satisfying the count. But then, the phone in the bubble rang. I felt a surge of ancient stone-cold dread. I knew that ring. It was the outside line, the one that bypasses the facility's scramblers. The new Miller picked it up. "Hello?" I listened as his face went pale, as his eyes filled with that same hollow, righteous fury I'd seen in the snow.
I listened as he heard the voice of his own daughter calling from a farm that no longer existed. "Daddy, there's a man at the window." I wanted to tell him to hang up. I wanted to tell him that the girl on the phone was just a bridge, a manifestation of the building's hunger. But I couldn't. My voice was the humming in the walls, the crackle of the static, the sound of the magnetic locks. I was the trap, and he was the prey. He looked at the logbook. He looked at the empty line beneath the names I'd written, and then he looked at his own hand. A drop of blood fell onto the page. The ink swirled and rearranged itself. The 5 curved and twisted, turning into a 6. 76. The facility groaned with pleasure. The foundation expanded, pushing further into the void. We were growing. We were consuming. The count was 76, and the shift was accelerating. I felt the new Miller stand up, his movements stiff and mechanical. He picked up the bone keys. He walked toward cell 412. I waited for him in the dark. I had a bedroom waiting for him, a recreation of his own life, vivid and impossible. I had his own memories ready to be harvested, to power the lights and the locks for another 100 years. As he turned the corner, I let the humming reach a crescendo. I let the lights pulse in time with his racing heart. I let the steel door of 412 swing open, a dark, liquid invitation. He stepped inside, and as the door clicked shut behind him, I realized that I wasn't the only one in the foundation. Miller was here. Arthur Vance was here. Thomas Cale was here. We were all here, a collective of anchors holding up a world that didn't want us. We reached out with our stone hands and welcomed him home. "Next," we whispered through the vents. The count was 76. And the shift never ends. The transition from 75 to 76 sent a shudder through the entire facility, a ripple of expansion that felt like a tectonic shift in the limestone. I felt the north laundry room groan as the dryers spun faster, their heat radiating through the walls like a fever. I felt the north gate, Gate 4, flicker out of existence for a microsecond before stabilizing as something even more imposing. It was no longer a sallyport. It was a cathedral of rust, a gateway to a reality where the Hudson Valley was merely a series of footnotes in a ledger of shadows. The new officer, the one I had just witnessed being archived, didn't scream when the door to 412 closed. He didn't pound on the steel. He simply sat down on the hospital bed that was now his permanent station and began to hum. It was a low, mournful sound, a melody of lost chances and unpaid debts. It was a song I knew well. It was the sound of a soul settling into the concrete. In the control bubble, the man who had replaced me, the one I had called the new Miller, was staring at the monitors with a glazed expression. He had seen the count change to 76. He had seen his own blood become the ink. He was no longer trying to find an exit. He was trying to find a rhythm. He picked up the bone pen and began to draw intricate geometric patterns in the margins of the logbook, shapes that matched the structural reinforcements of the block. He was becoming the architect of his own containment. I felt a new presence in the foundation beside me. It was the Elias Thorne who had just entered 412. He was cold, confused, still clutching the memories of a prosthetic leg and a foreclosure notice. I reached out with my stone thoughts and touched him, a gesture of cold comfort. "Don't fight the weight," I whispered through the limestone. "The weight is what keeps her safe. Every pound of pressure on your chest is a pound of freedom for her. Every second of your darkness is a second of her sun. It's a fair trade." He didn't answer, but his humming changed. It became steadier, a rhythmic pulse that synchronized with my own. We were 2 anchors now, sharing the burden of the count. The limestone field outside expanded further, the black water of the void receding as we pushed our reality into the dark. We could feel the other prisons, the 1,000 identical fortresses, vibrating in response. We were a choir of the damned, and our song was the only thing holding the universe together. Back in the real world, or what was left of it, Sarah Thorne was waking up in her bed at the farm. She didn't remember the man with her face at the window. She didn't remember the phone call or the static. She only remembered a dream about a horse that could run faster than the wind. She sat up, her legs strong and healthy, and looked out the window at the rising sun. She didn't know that the light was fueled by her father's sorrow. She didn't know that every breath she took was a gift from a man made of stone. She walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of milk. She didn't tap the glass. She didn't hum the building's tune. She was free. But in the bubble, the phone rang again. The new miller didn't hesitate this time. He picked it up with a steady hand. "Control," he said, his voice as flat and dry as a desert. I listened as the voice on the other end, a man in a clean uniform, looking for a job he couldn't afford to refuse, spoke his name. I listened as the cycle began again, as the bait was laid and the trap was set. "We have an opening," the new miller said, his eyes fixed on camera 4, where the wet footprints were now a permanent feature of the floor. "The pay is triple the state average. No questions asked. We just need someone who can follow the rhythm." I felt the new candidate's hope, his desperation, his love for someone he would eventually have to trade away. I felt him step onto the bus. I felt him approach the gate. The count was 76, but the facility was growing. It needed more anchors. It needed more weight. I settled into the deep, dark heart of the limestone, feeling the collective strength of the souls beside me. We were the foundation. We were the history. We were the truth beneath the lie. And as long as we held the line, as long as we accepted the weight, the world above could keep spinning in its ignorant, beautiful light. "Next," the facility whispered through 1,000 pipes, 1,000,000 wires, 1,000,000,000 pores in the concrete. The new man stepped off the bus. He looked up at the control bubble, his eyes full of a fear he didn't yet understand. He looked at the gate guard, whose mouth was a smooth, silent graft of skin. He looked at the blizzard, not knowing that it was the last real snow he would ever see. He entered the block. He stopped at the bubble. He saw the new miller. "Welcome to Blackwood," the new miller said, tapping his pen. Tink, tink, tink.
Almighty God,
"Check 412. I think I heard something humming." The man walked toward the cell. He didn't know that he was walking into his own bedroom. He didn't know that he was about to become the ink on the page. I waited for him in the stone. I had a place ready for him. The shift was beginning. The count was moving to 77, and the humming was the only song we had left to sing. I closed my eyes and felt the sun on Sarah's face. It was warm, it was real, and it was worth every century of stone. "Next," I whispered, my voice lost in the roaring silence of the house. And in the world of men, a steel door slammed shut. The sound of that door echoed through the foundation like a gunshot, a finality that rippled through the limestone and made the black water of the void churn. I felt the new man, Officer 77, hesitate at the threshold of 412. I could feel his uncertainty, the way his mind was frantically trying to rationalize the geometry of the hallway, the temperature of the air, the rhythmic vibration in his own marrow. He was looking for a logical explanation, a way to make the world make sense again. He didn't know that sense was a luxury the building had already stripped away. "Step inside," I thought, the command vibrating through the floorboards beneath his feet. "The physical therapy bills are waiting. The foreclosure can be stopped. The debt can be managed. All you have to do is satisfy the count." He pushed the door open. The bedroom inside, his bedroom, was perfect. The smell of his wife's perfume, the sound of his son's breathing from the crib, the specific comforting creak of the floorboards. It was a masterpiece of seduction,
a simulation designed to bypass his defenses and strike directly at the core of his vulnerability. He stepped inside, his shoulders slumping with relief, unaware that the moment his boot crossed the threshold, the door behind him had ceased to be an exit. It was now a seal. In the control bubble, the new Miller was already writing. He didn't wait for the blood to fall. He knew the procedure. He understood the economy of the house. He wrote the name of the new man's son in the logbook, his hand moving with a cold, mechanical precision. He was no longer just an observer. He was a participant in the harvest. He watched the monitor for 412, saw the new man sit down on the bed, and then he turned his attention back to camera 4. The laundry room was a whirlwind of motion now, the dryers spinning so fast they were becoming blurs of orange and gray. The count was 77, and the building was accelerating. Beside me in the foundation, the Elias Thorne who had been 76 was finally still. His humming had settled into a low, steady drone, a perfect harmonic of my own. We were becoming a single entity, a composite anchor made of shared sorrow and collective weight. I could feel Miller, Vance, Cale, all of them, vibrating in unison. We were the heartbeat of Blackwood, the rhythmic tink-tink-tink that governed the reality of the block. The auditor stood in the command center, his ashen form towering over the rows of monitors. He was no longer just watching, he was conducting. His long, spindly fingers moved through the air like a maestro's baton, directing the flow of souls, the distribution of memory, the calibration of the count. He looked down through the floor, through the limestone, directly at me. "The facility is expanding into the tri-state area," he intoned, his voice a series of grinding tectonic plates. "The manifest is growing by 5% every hour. We need more anchors, Elias. We need more weight. The world is heavy, and the void is deep." "I'll carry it," I replied, the thought echoing through the foundation. "I'll carry it all." "You will," the auditor agreed. "You will carry the weight of every man who walks through that gate. You will carry the weight of every child who walks in the real world because of a trade made in the dark. You will be the foundation of a new geography, a world made of limestone and iron and eternal shifts." I looked at the monitor for the farm. Sarah was sitting on the porch reading a book. She looked up and smiled at something I couldn't see. A bird, a cloud, a memory of a horse. She was beautiful. She was alive. She was the reason the limestone didn't shatter under the pressure of the void. But then I saw a movement in the trees at the edge of the field. A black transport bus was idling in the shadows. Its headlights were cut, its engine a low, rhythmic thrum. A man in an orange jumpsuit was standing by the road, waving a slow, deliberate hand at her. My stone heart gave a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror. "No!" I screamed through the foundation. "The trade is made. The debt is paid. She is supposed to be free." The auditor's laughter was the sound of a building collapsing. "Free is a relative term, Elias. She is free as long as the count is satisfied." "But the count is growing. The facility's needs are increasing. She is no longer just a beneficiary of the contract. She is a legacy. She is the next generation of the house." I watched in horror as Sarah stood up from the porch. She didn't look afraid. She looked curious. She walked toward the edge of the field, toward the man in the orange jumpsuit. She reached out a hand, and as her fingers touched the cold metal of the bus, I felt a new cable sprout from my chest, a thick, pulsing artery of sorrow that connected me directly to her. "The audit never ends, Elias," the auditor whispered. "It only becomes more personal." I felt the weight on my chest double, triple, quadruple. The limestone beneath me groaned, the black water of the void rushing in to fill the cracks. I felt the collective humming of 77 souls turn into a scream of agony as we were all pushed deeper into the dark. We were the foundation, but the building was becoming too heavy. We were the history, but the present was too demanding. Sarah entered the bus. The doors hissed shut. The vehicle began to reverse, its tires leaving no marks on the grass. She looked out the window at the farmhouse, her eyes already turning that flat ash grey. She looked at the road, not knowing that it was leading her to Gate 4, to the sally port of Rust, to the control bubble where a new miller was waiting to write her name in a logbook made of skin. "Welcome home, Sarah," the facility whispered through 1,000 vents. I settled into the final, deepest layer of the stone, the pressure so intense that my thoughts were becoming diamonds of pure, crystalline pain. I was the house. I was the trap. I was the reason she was coming, and I would be the one to hold her up when she finally stepped onto the limestone. The shift was beginning again. The count was moving to 78, and the humming was the only thing I had left to give her. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of the world. It was heavy. It was dark. But in the center of the scream, I could still feel the horse that could run faster than the wind. And for now, that was enough. "Next," I whispered, the word lost in the roaring silence of the heart. And in the world of men, a steel door slammed shut.